As indigenous people, we share the same pain no matter where we are. We see and feel the pain behind those 215 children and the families that are connected to them. This podcast is strictly to educate and share what we know of boarding schools, because those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it.
A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In this sense, I agree with that sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indians there are in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. This was Richard Henry Spratt's motto around 1879. Hi, this is Daja Torres.
And Orlando Trevino, and today we're talking about Indian boarding schools experience.
Manifest Destiny drove white Americans to believe that the native people needed to integrate to white norms because it is cheaper to give them education than to fight them. Or at least this is what Hiram Price, who was Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1885, believed. So by 1860, the first Indian boarding school was established in the Yakima Reservation in Washington state, according to nativepartnership.org.
Pratt also believed that because the schools were on the reservations, there was still an Indian influence. So to end the influence, Pratt established an off-reservation boarding school in Pennsylvania called the Carlisle Indian School in 1879. This new boarding school was surrounded by the ideology of taking the kids away from their culture and away from their family. That ideology transferred into the infamous quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man." NativePartnership.org reported that the students had lived with white host families, were stripped of their native looks, boys' hair was cut and styled differently, they were forced to wear uniforms, and banned from their native foods, and finally were given white names.
Los Chanio, Quechamalia, Guxtash. My name is Miguel Flores Jr. I'm a member of the Pasco Yaqui tribe and Tonato Nation. My parents are Miguel D. Flores, Rosalia Mendoza Flores. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents are the late Juan Mendoza, Emilia Alvarez Mendoza. My paternal grandparents are the late Felix Flores and Defina Duarte Flores, and these are my relations, and it's good to be here today. My profession is I am a licensed therapist, but we also provide cultural competency training.
Boarding schools forced Native Americans to learn English through punishment by physically harming students if they did not speak to others in English. This caused the fear of the native language. This fear trickled down into later generations as younger members of tribes wanted to learn their native language. Because of these punishments, the older members who had experienced their times at boarding schools were scared to teach the young their language.
It was kind of like boot camp. If you didn't follow these things, then there was consequences to those actions, because again, some people were beaten, some people were molested, some people were, there's horrible things.
The American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse says former boarding school attendees reported higher rates of current illicit drug use and living with alcohol use disorder, and were significantly more likely to have attempted suicide and experienced suicidal thoughts in their lifetime compared to non-attendees. This is a result of the boarding schools assimilating native children to behave like white children through education.
So again, I do see it as if they did not receive this nurturing or understanding of culture, their language, their songs, and have that reinforced, then again, they were kind of lost when they back to the community, because again, when they went back to the communities, being native was bad, being Indian was bad, and by that time they didn't know the language, they didn't know the ceremonies, and a lot of those teachings during those years of education from a child to adolescence, a lot of things weren't taught, so a lot of things weren't known. So again, that's where you kind of have that loss of connection to your tribe, connection to your community, connection to your songs, your culture, your language. And so again, a lot with some of those families, a lot of those things have been lost. So when you lose those things, you find other things from the community that may not be so positive to kind of fill in that void.
They were taught reading, writing, science, and art to civilize them. They were also taught about private property, material wealth, and nuclear families, causing the loss of culture. Religion was forced onto these native children. The goal was to teach subjects that contradicted their native cultures and ideologies.
However, not every experience was a completely negative one. While she speaks only of the positive times, there were also the negatives. Boarding schools never came to Dr. Aviso as a completely bad thing in her life. Although she did not go, virtually everyone around her did. The sad memory of her grandparents dropping off her aunts and uncles always made Dr. Arvizo wonder, why? Why did they have to go away? She would have to wait until they came back, where they told her stories of boarding schools. Her excitement was shown in this interview, as she told us many of her friends would come back to tell her about the dorm-like rooms they were given, and how boarding schools rooming was better than the situations at home. In the past, the rooms at the boarding schools were set up like a military-style room, but as time progressed, the newer rooms at the newer boarding schools became more and more like a typical college dorm you'd see today. There were showers down the hall, a desk, and 2 beds. Dr. Arvizo also talked about the skills people close to her have developed while in boarding schools, and how they helped exceed those individuals in their lives beyond the boarding schools. A story she shared was one where her uncle had gone to the military, and due to boarding school's meticulous style of doing chores, he was put on a whole other level than the rest of the recruits. She retold the account of her uncle's bed-making skills by explaining how when the drill sergeant threw a coin on his bed, it would bounce off. It was so well done. And while there were some hurtful memories regarding the boarding school experience, Dr. Arvizo kept repeating a topic of opportunity, and how many of the people I mentioned before really took them. She explains how the schools gave a competitive edge to the community with their sports and the opportunities deriving from the boarding school's programs. This idea of taking an opportunity derived from the feeling of responsibility to her family to get an education. One last story she told was from her grandmother. Dr. Arvizo talked about how her grandmother's parents had hid her grandmother away so she would not have to attend boarding schools. At first, it seems like that was the best option. However, her grandmother always regretted not going because she wanted to get an education, not just for herself, but for her family. This story has motivated Dr. Arvizo. The same story of longing for education reverberates throughout the native nations. Dr. Arvizo summarizes that boarding schools were mostly a positive influence on her through education and opportunity.
But why did parents let their children go to boarding schools? The director from the Arizona State University's American Indian Studies program reported to NPR that most of the time children were forced to go and were often taken by armed police. If it was voluntary, it was because there were no other options for education due to the racism towards Native American. According to Kay McGowan from the Eastern Michigan University, that from 1860 to the 1990s, over 180,000 Native children were taken away from their families and forced into boarding schools. Statistics pulled from the boardingSchoolHealing.org read, by 1926, nearly 83% of Indian school-aged children were attending boarding schools. There were 350 boarding schools in 30 states. And by 1920, there were about 60,889 children enrolled in these Indian boarding schools. In Phoenix, the Phoenix Indian School had diseases and illnesses spreading around 1899. Measles, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other illnesses were going around. And NativePartnership.org reported that 9 children died in just 10 days. The Washington Post reported that between 1879 through 1918, about 200 children were buried at Carlisle, and on August 7, 2017, the U.S. Army dug up graves of 3 children who died at Carlisle boarding school. Their names were Little Chief, Horse, and Little Plum, claimed the Washington Post. Still today, The Intercept wrote about how tribal nations are still trying to figure out what happened to the children buried, since so many children never made it home. Thank you for listening. This has been Orlando and Daja at the Arizona Indian Research Center for Health at the University of Arizona. Until next time.